we're now going to see the process of adjustments and credit notes in Dynamics AX. Adjustments is the process of making updates to posted transactions, and credit notes is the process of making or returning something to the customer that you have already invoiced them for. Dynamics AX allows you to make changes to posted transactions and invoices, both of them. And the vehicle, as I mentioned, the vehicle for making adjustments or changes to posted transactions that haven't been invoiced is the process of adjustment. And the process of making changes to a transaction that has already been invoiced, that process will have to go through the credit note processing, where you return the money that you charge the customer back to the customer, and then you process adjustment or change the transaction and then re-invoice the customer. So let's first look at the adjustment process. Once a transaction has been posted to the GL, then you'll have to use the adjustment functionality. Let's navigate to the Maintain tab on the contract details page. Let's open the posted transactions list page that shows us the list of transactions that have already been posted for this particular contract. So we have 2 transactions. Now, in order to make an adjustment, you will have to open the transaction on the list page, or you will have to open the transaction in the details page, but you have a button, an entry point to the adjust functionality from both places. Let's select this transaction, and let's say the adjustment date is today's date, and so the transaction has been selected for adjustment. And now this dialog asks us what is it that we would like to adjust. We'll also have an ability to adjust even after we OK on this dialog. You can put in an activity number, a category, so we can set up new values for the line that is selected through here. Like say if this is a chargeable line, you may want to change the chargeability and say I do not want to bill this to the customer, so it's so you can make it a non-billable line by selecting this. Or you can change the cost, sales, or any of those values. Or you can say this was picked up at a different price, and you may want to say reapply the rate card. You may have overwritten the price on this transaction. You may want to use your rate card, established rate card, to default the price. So that's where you can say, set all of these fields. And once you set these fields, then you hit OK. The transaction with the new values is shown on the grid below. You still can adjust this transaction. You can post it to a different category. You can change the price of it. You can say this is not 300, this is actually 350. And you can change any of these values, and you can now post an adjustment to this transaction. So once you hit post, the transaction is adjusted and new transactions are created. Let's look behind on the posted transactions list page and see what has happened to the old transaction and what has been created. Let's close out of the adjustment window, and this is the posted transactions page for this contract. So let's refresh this page. And now we see we have the 2 transactions. We have 2 more transactions that have been. So there was this was our old transaction, and that has been marked as being non-chargeable. There is a complete back out of the old transaction for the full amount, which is also marked as non-chargeable. And there is a new transaction with the new sales price of $350 that is created, and that's the one chargeable. Now, when we create an invoice for this particular contract, we see the new transaction with the $17,000 amount being pulled up, with the $350 price being pulled up for invoicing. But the old transactions that have been marked as non-chargeable do not show up on the invoice. So that is how the adjustment process works in Dynamics AX. But please remember that if if you wish to change just the sales price or the description of the transaction, you do not need to post an adjustment on the transaction. You can directly change on the invoice proposal. Let's say I go ahead and create an invoice proposal, right? So I'll show you how it is a lot easier to change the sales price of the transaction without going through the adjustment functionality first. So we'll go ahead and create, since we have, this is a contract that has two funding sources. So we can see both the funding sources and the on-hold funding source. So let's say we create the transaction for the invoice for active transport. Now we see only the active transport related transaction. And over here you can, when you edit the invoice, you can change the sales price on the transaction, or you can put in a description. And for these fields, you don't necessarily have to go through the adjustment process. It's only when you want to change the cost or the category itself, or then you need to go through the adjustment process. About credit notes, so now that we have created an invoice, let's see how we can generate a credit for the invoice. For that, it is required that we first post the invoice that we created. So we created one invoice for active transport. Let's go to the Maintain tab on the contract page, and let's see all the invoice, open project invoice proposals. We have this one. Let's go ahead and post that project invoice. So that invoice has been posted now, and it has been invoiced. And let's open this up. And now you see that there is an invoice number here. This is the confirmed invoice that will be sent to the customer. And so let's open up that invoice. So that is the invoice that has been created. Now once this represents the invoice that has been sent to the customer. Now if you need to make any adjustments to transactions that have already been put on a confirmed invoice that was sent to the customer, then the process is credit note. So you'll go to the invoice list page, the confirmed or invoice journals list page, and when you expand, you can say select for credit note, and that selects this particular invoice for credit note. Now if this invoice had other transactions, they would also show up here as different tabs. But let's say I want to select this transaction and I want to mark it for credit note. That process has marked that transaction for credit note, which means the next time I create an invoice for active transport, that transaction will be picked up to be returned to the customer. So let's see how that process works. We'll go to this, we'll go back to our contracts page. And we'll go to the invoice proposal, and let's pick active transport. And that shows us one transaction with a complete negative backed out entry, which determines the credit note. Notice the field here that is invoicing method. Both indicates that if there are any billable transactions for active transport, those would also be available and would be showing up on the create invoice proposal dialog. If you set that to credit note, if you set the invoicing method to credit note, only those transactions that are credited transactions that are marked for credit note in the process that I showed you before this frame, only those transactions would show up. Any billable transactions do not show up. Both indicates that anything pending for active transport that hasn't been billed, both credits and actual chargeable transaction, all of them start to show up. So this is in a nutshell the process for generating credit notes out of invoice transactions in AX. So let's go ahead and process this invoice proposal, and let's see what happens to this transaction. So let's go ahead and post this invoice proposal. Now this is a credit note invoice proposal. So the moment this invoice proposal is posted, let's navigate to the project posted transactions list page, and we will see that this transaction that was invoice that was in invoice status is now available and it's ready to be charged again. So the idea behind crediting something to the customer is that there could have been a discussion, a dispute about this transaction. So you may have processed a return to the customer, and now once you've processed the return to the customer, the transaction becomes available for invoicing. And if there is any change that needs to be done on the transaction, that will have to go through the adjustment process. So let's review the concepts that we have gone through in the adjustments and credit notes section. So the adjustment is the process of changing a posted transaction that hasn't yet been invoiced. And changing the fields that have financial impact usually result in one fully backed out transaction and one new transaction. And the new transaction is the one that is marked as chargeable so that it can be put on an invoice. And adjustments can be allowed depending on the status of the transaction. Credit notes. Credit note is the process of returning something to the customer that has already been invoiced. It is different from adjustments in the sense that credit note, once processed, returns the amounts to the customer, and then the transaction becomes available to be billed to the customer one more time. Posting a credit note makes the transactions that have already been invoiced become chargeable again. And invoicing method, there are three types of invoicing methods. There is the transactions that are positive or transactions that are chargeable that can be invoiced, and there are credit notes which involve negative transactions, and you can also have an invoicing method that includes both chargeable transactions as well as credited transactions when creating your invoice proposal.